Many cultures are ancient, evolved from centuries of hardship and cultivation. Mexican culture is just that, a unique amalgamation of Spanish and Mesoamerican peoples. But, as with any culture, the centuries have given rise to stories, legends, and myths that were meant to horrify children and caution adults. Sometimes, these myths are more than just hearsay. So, enjoy these 10 allegedly real ghost stories from Mexico. If you want to be in a future video, we're looking for stories about the Ravenmonger and confessions from teachers. Send them to me at darknessprevails.org. Thank you. Number 1. Little Impersonator by CassieBella. I still don't understand what happened that day. We've moved from that house since, and it's been a long time, but I remember it like it was yesterday. I remember I could not sleep that night. I was just a 14-year-old girl. Now, I don't get scared much anymore, and I love anything scary or horror related. But when I was little, I was scared of almost everything. Any little bump at night and I would start crying. But this experience was much different. Back then, I was still terrified of the dark, and I would sleep with my TV on. My old house was very small as well, and only had 3 rooms, one for me, my sister, and my parents. I was having trouble sleeping that night. My baby sister cried every few minutes. She was only 4 and she got scared way easier than me. Unfortunately, this was around the time my parents decided to ignore her crying, to try to get her to be more independent. But I was starting to get annoyed, so I took her into my room to let her sleep with me. I had a bunk bed after all, so it was fine. We said our goodnights to each other and fell asleep. Well, my sister did. I stayed awake, and I watched the TV that lit up my room. That's when I noticed something. The closet door was open. I had been playing with my cousin Lily that morning before we went to school. We always played before school like that. The thing is, we always close the door. We double-check that we close it before leaving to school. That's because there's a large doll in the closet that we sometimes play with, but we always pretended it was haunted. Deep down, I believed it, and it scared me. So I simply closed that door so I didn't have to look at it. I got out of bed and slowly crept toward the closet. I got up close to the door. I quickly turned the light on and I peeked inside. It was a relief. The doll was still in its place, but something was off. My clothes were messed up. Oddly enough, my shirts had been taken off the hanger, turned inside out, and then hung back up. And my pants were the same, but they had been placed back in the drawer. Besides that, everything else was in place. Considering my overly organized mom was the one who hung my clothes and folded them, there was no way this was her mistake and had hung up my clothes inside out. Feeling odd, but not entirely creeped out, I slowly turned off the light and closed the doors to the closet. Then I crawled back into bed. I wasn't really that scared, just confused. How did someone do that without making any noise? Or who had come into my room and I didn't notice it, just to pull a weird prank like that? I laid in my bed and I continued to watch the TV when my mother suddenly walked in. "Hey, did you come into our room?" she asked. I shook my head and I told her that I had been in my room the entire time. "Well, we heard someone come in and we already asked your sister if it was her," she said. What? I was confused even more now. My sister had been in my room the whole time, and neither of us had left. My sister was still below me in the bunk bed. My mother didn't seem to notice this, then left the room after I answered her. She had told me to go to sleep. But after hearing this, and the situation getting more confusing and suspicious, there was no way I could sleep. How in the world did someone go in my parents' room when my sister and I had been here the whole time? For about a week after that, I had a lot of trouble sleeping. Every little noise made me jump. Better yet, Every morning when I'd get dressed for school, my clothes were always inside out. For an entire week, I would have to realign my clothes before leaving for school, something that took quite a long time. But then the next morning, they would all be inside out again, without any explanation. My little sister believed my story, as it was happening to her too. Her clothes would have been tampered with when she went back to her room to get dressed. For someone so young, she was pretty smart, observant of her surroundings more so than the average girl her age. One day, she was in her room playing with little pony dolls and Barbie dolls. I was hanging with Lily, and my parents were outside. She told me she left her room for a snack, and when she went back, all the heads and hands had been pulled or cut off of her dolls. I believed her, because when I got back home, I saw it for myself. She couldn't have done it herself, because she was much too short to reach the drawer with the scissors in them, and she would never break one of her own toys. My parents would have gone crazy. More strange things continued to happen throughout the next few months, and after a couple of years, we decided to move. With my dad having family in California, and since he was able to get citizenship in America, we ended up moving there from Mexico. A few years after we moved, my mother told me a story that frightened me. She said that she had gotten up one morning when we were still in Mexico. She said that she had gotten up one morning on a Saturday. At the time, I was staying over at a friend's house, and my sister was sleeping in my mom's bedroom. My mother had gotten up to get a drink from the kitchen when she suddenly heard my sister calling her, but it was coming from my little sister's bedroom. My mother wasn't thinking straight and walked right into my sister's room, forgetting that she wasn't even in that room. My mother looked around, not seeing my sister in that room, but being tired and groggy so early in the morning, she was convinced that my sister was somewhere in there. Suddenly, she heard my little sister's voice calling again, this time from her closet. She was about to go to the closet when she suddenly heard my sister yelling from her bedroom, my mother's bedroom. She had had a nightmare and was scared when she saw her mother wasn't there. The closet door that my mother was almost at had been opened a little bit, so when she had stopped and listened to my actual little sister getting out of bed, the closet door suddenly slammed shut. Freaking out, my mother grabbed my sister and left the house until she had to pick me up. She then told my dad that night, but he didn't believe her. They suggested that they move a few months after, and as I said, we're now in California. And I'm so glad we're here. I still think about it sometimes, wondering what would have happened if my sister never cried out for my mom, and if my mom had, in fact, opened the closet door. Number 2. The Spooky Red by Emanuel. It was the summer of 2008. Our family had a tradition to go to Mexico every year for school break. It was always a good time, getting the family together with our cousins from USA and all our cousins from Mexico. We have quite a large family. We'd all gather together and would stay at our grandma's house, located in a very small Mexican town. Once there, all the adults would just hang out together and catch up on family gossip, while all the cousins would hang out. We were around the ages of 17 to 22. One night, we were hanging out at around 2:40 a.m. Two of our cousins would be staying with their other side of the family that night. As it was a small town, the house they would be staying at was only about 10 minutes away, and that's by walking. It was late, and my uncles who had the only vehicles were sleeping. The town was quite safe at the time, so we let the family know that we were going to walk over there in order to escort our two cousins who would be staying at a different place that night, as I said before. I didn't really want them to walk alone, and they were good company. It was about 3 a.m. by the time we were all walking. By then, there were still people hanging out in the streets, but mostly in restaurants or bars or just outside of them. As we walked in front of the main church of the town, I found myself curious to look up at the high tower where the bell was located. As I looked, I noticed there was a person all dressed in a long red dress, their face covered in a red hat. They were looking at us, spying on us. As the person noticed that I had seen them, they slowly backed away into the darker part of the tower until I could no longer see them. By then, I was gulping and breathing slowly in and out. The sighting gave me chills. I thought I must have been going crazy, as there was no way a person could climb out in the tower like that, where there was no light, especially at 3 a.m. while the church was closed. Suddenly, one of my cousins spoke up, saying, "Guys, did you just see some dude in red in the tower?" I gulped again. By then, we were running for our destination. Luckily, it was only a few yards away from the church itself. We dropped off my cousins, and we took a different path so that we did not have to cross by the church again. The next day, we explained the sighting to my uncles and aunts. They weren't surprised at all, and they explained to us why. Before the church was being built, the entire area there used to be a cemetery, and most people would encounter strange figures while walking past it anytime after midnight. To this day, I still wonder what they were. Was it a he, a she? Was it really a ghost? Why were they that high in the tower in the pitch black dark? And why, if they didn't want to be seen, were they wearing all bright red? So many unanswered questions. From then on, we learned to not be out in that area past 12. Number 3. The Duende by Miguel. I was born and raised in Texas, but all of my family before me came from Mexico. Particularly, my mother lived in a very small Mexican town and what amounted to a hut. Her parents had always been very superstitious, and apparently they had very good reason to be. Because my grandfather had an encounter with the Duende, an encounter that left him scarred. Now, I've talked to my grandpa about this story before. My grandpa's always full of stories, and you can always tell what kind of story you're in for by the look in his face and the tone in his voice. If he's got a story to scare you, he'll smile and try to sound real creepy. If he's got one to make you laugh, he'll laugh with you, with a big old smile strewn across his face. Needless to say, whenever he talked about this story, he would often simply tell me that he wasn't in the mood to talk about it, while looking at his foot. He would never smile when discussing the story, and it seemed to sting him or hurt him whenever he did talk about it. Well, this is the story from my grandfather. He's passed away now, but I will always remember his tales, especially this one. Growing up in the forests of Mexico was a hard life, he said. From dusk till dawn, from the moment he woke up to the moment he went to bed, it was work. My grandpa had to attend to chickens and goats, had to harvest or maintain corn crops, and fetch water. He said it was a hard life, but he didn't really realize how hard it was until things became easier. He'd always make a point to tell me how good I had it in America, and then he'd always say, "At least you don't have the Duende here." The first time I heard him say that, I quickly asked, "What are the Duende, Grandpa?" Well, he told me, but not before showing me his foot. It was his right foot. Now, Grandpa almost always wore boots. He never took them off when he entered the house, and would only take them off if he was going to bed or taking a shower. But on this occasion, he made a special request. He took off his right boot and showed me. Right away, I noticed it and nearly threw up. Seeing my face, he said to me, "It's all right." He said it was okay to react that way. He was talking about his big toe, the top half of which was missing in an almost perfectly cut straight line. Part of me wanted to touch it, and the other part wanted to run into the kitchen and grab my mom. I asked him, "Does it hurt?" He said no, but way back when it first happened, it definitely did. He said it hurt for a couple of months even, until it healed and got calloused. Of course, completely curious and intrigued, I asked my grandpa how it happened, and he reminded me, "The Duende, my child." He then went on to tell me the experience he had with the supposed Duende. Now, Duende are fairies of Mexican folklore. Some of the stories portray them as helpful little creatures, while other stories portray them as mischievous and evil. In appearance, Duende are little people, something he described as 2 feet tall at most. He said they were known to help people who were lost in the woods. But other people's tales speak of the creatures as things that would take advantage of you or play pranks just to have fun. They're said to inhabit the woods, or sometimes even inhabit the walls of your home. Particularly, they're very fond of children. Well, my grandpa at the time of this story was 11 years old, still very much a child, despite the hard work he performed on a day-to-day basis. Now, it all started one night, just out of nowhere it seemed. My grandpa began to hear noises in the walls. Noises that sounded like people whispering, people laughing here and there. The first time he heard it, he yelled for his mother and father. And when they came in to check on him, they quickly disbelieved him. My grandpa quickly realized that he was alone on this. So in the coming days, when he actually had some free time, he walked a couple of miles to his aunt's house because his aunt had a lot of books and was a superstitious woman. He explained his experience to her and how they came back every night, the whispering and the laughter. She asked him a few questions, wanted to know if he was wide awake when it happened. He said yes. This was when he first heard of the Duende. She described them to him exactly as I did before to you. Little people, fairies, mischievous or often nice. My grandpa, being naive, probably because of his age, was smiling at this point. He said he remembered being so excited, just the thought of magical creatures living alongside him in his walls. But seeing the smile on his face, his aunt warned him, saying that he can't know what kind of creatures they really are and that this was just a guess. She was sure to tell him before he left that if they truly were Duende, that they could never be trusted. Not taking this to heart, my grandpa quickly returned home and helped his father with a few remaining chores. That night, when his parents had gone to bed, my grandpa got out of bed and began to tap on the walls, and he would whisper, "I can hear you. Are you there?" He says when he heard the tapping back from something in the wall, he was all giddy. He said he asked them if they wanted to be friends. He told them they could come out anytime they wanted and that they were welcome in his home. He says that was his mistake, claiming that the place he lived and had been born in was his property. Whatever was in the walls, it didn't take too kindly to that. The laughing turned to snarling, and my grandpa, suddenly afraid, quickly curled up in his bed and could only go back to sleep when everything got quiet again. It was in the morning that he realized just how dire the consequences were. When he woke up, he noticed that his foot was moist and that there was a deep stinging sensation in one of his toes. He quickly pulled the sheets away and saw that the top half of his big toe on the right foot was missing. Not to mention that his toenails had been cut on all of his other toes. He screamed, and in came his father and mother. He said he remembered the look on their faces. There was nothing to disbelieve now. Obviously, with his toe halfway gone, his mother began crying, and his father was shaking him and grabbing him by the shoulders, asking him why he did this to himself. When he explained what happened, or what he thought happened, talking about the Duende, they looked at him like he was crazy. They assumed that he had hurt himself, but they were simply in denial. For the next month or two, he had to stay in bed because it hurt to walk. His father, angry at this because he no longer had help on the farm, tore down his bedroom walls where he claimed to have heard the Duende, just to show my grandpa that nothing was there. Apparently, that was enough to scare them away, because my grandpa never heard or saw much of the Duende after that. But still, he can feel an ache in his toe whenever he thinks about what happened. He swears deep down to his very soul that he knows it was the Duende. He told me, with a warning and caution in his voice, that if I ever began to hear the talking and laughing in my walls, to tell him right away. Now that he's gone and I think about his warning, I do get nervous, because now I have no one to run to if something like that ever happens to me. Number 4. Footsteps by Jasmine. My aunt was living in Mexico with her 2 young children. They had moved into my old childhood home. It was a 2-story house that had an outdoor open kitchen. It was a really cute place when compared to the other houses in that small rural town. One night, her teenage niece was staying over because she wanted to use my aunt's computer for a school project. My aunt and her children slept in together in her room, and her niece was supposed to sleep in the room next to theirs when she was finished using the computer, which was in my aunt's room. My aunt had been in a deep sleep when she suddenly woke up because she heard someone going down the stairs. She assumed it was her niece that was going to sneak out of the house to be with her boyfriend or some other rebellious teenage thing. My aunt waited and listened when she heard footsteps coming back up the stairs. Still assuming it was her niece, she simply changed her mind about confronting her because she apparently changed her mind about sneaking out. A little while later, she heard the footsteps go down again. Now she was mad and yelled to her niece, "Anna, go to bed." She heard her niece reply in a meek voice, "Auntie, I'm right here." My aunt turned around to see that her niece was sitting at the computer, trembling with fear. "I heard those footsteps too." My aunt then told her niece to get in the bed with her and her children. They laid there together, shivering, waiting for the footsteps to approach their door or to go back downstairs. But then there was a massive crash. It came from somewhere downstairs, glass breaking and shattering. The sound was loud and clear. Somehow, my aunt had a feeling that this was not a person inside her home, but she was too afraid to get up and be sure. My aunt and her niece stayed awake the entire night, but they didn't hear anything else. In the morning, they went down to check what was broken. But the thing is, there wasn't anything anywhere. No broken glass, no broken anything, nothing had been tampered with. It was as if the sounds they heard were simply just that, sounds with no origin. For the next couple of months, my aunt and her children lived there. They kept hearing those noises at night, and they could not explain it. Number 5. La Siguanaba by Harold Q. This is a story from my dad. My dad used to live along the border of Mexico. He was poor, a rancher, and life was pretty hard. When he was 17 or 18, my dad was in the Guatemalan army. He had his fair share of strange encounters. He thought he wasn't going to serve for any war or anything like that, so he stayed in the army later in his service. He was told they were going to Mexico for some type of violence act that was going on down there, but he did not want to go because it was at the time he met my mom, and he refound his reason to live, basically. He was told that they were leaving late at night so they could get to the border in the morning. They rounded up the soldiers to load them up, and my dad was looking for a place to hide. When they were heading to the trucks, my dad ran out of the group suddenly and jumped in what he thought was a cave. He later realized it was actually a tomb of some sort. As he saw the trucks leaving, he started looking around the cavern when he saw a woman with hair over her face, wearing a stained and tattered nightgown. He was quickly horrified. He jumped up and ran out of the tomb extremely fast. He then ran home and told his mom and grandma what he saw. They told him it was the La Siguanaba, which is a type of shape-shifting witch. My dad didn't believe it, rather believing it was just some strange homeless person. That night he went to bed, happy he had dodged any fights over in Mexico. A couple of days passed. At one point he woke up in the middle of the night to go to the bathroom. There was no plumbing or electricity where he lived back then, so he went outside to do his business. He walked out of the house and walked around the corner of the house, and there was a banana tree. He went over to it to start to do his business. It was all too late when he saw the same woman from before. She was standing next to the chicken coop, which was right next to where he had stopped to use the bathroom. He started to walk slowly back to the house. By the time he reached the porch, he saw yellow glowing eyes peeking at him from behind her hair. He ran inside, locked the doors, and tried to get some rest. In the morning, he told my grandma that he had seen her again. She told him it was only going to get worse if he didn't cleanse himself of it. She said the girl would only continue to follow him and try to take him away. Finally, he listened, and he would go later in the week to get cleansed. My dad was a rancher, so he needed to wake up early to milk the cows. That's even how my grandpa still makes his living. Anyway, my dad was woken up one day by laughing just outside. He said it wasn't normal laughter either. It was more like a woman laughing and screaming at the same time. He then began to hear scratching on the roof just above him. The roof was aluminum, which made a very terrible sound. He said that it was like there were big rocks being thrown and sliding on the roof. Now, it's really hard to scare my dad, but he said at the time he feared for his life. He ended up grabbing his rifle and went outside to see what was causing that noise. He went around the side of the house where the banana tree was. He was walking slowly when he saw a black cat by the chicken coop, and it had the same yellow kind of eyes. He fired at it. He said when it hit the cat, it let out a horrifying scream like a woman being burned alive. He put his hands up to his ears. The next moment, after he blinked, there was a woman where the cat had been. The same woman, of course. She jumped on top of the house like some sort of inhuman creature and began to scream with her mouth wide open. It was the same scream he had been hearing. It had been her that was on his roof. He said that once he couldn't see her, he started to look around, and in the morning he went to go see a woman to cleanse him. She said unfortunately, the Siguanaba was already attached to him and was not going to leave him alone easily. My dad begged her how he could get rid of her, and the woman told him it was going to take days. When he went home later, he told one of his friends. His friend decided to join him to keep him company. He said they were drinking and talking when they heard someone running on the house. This time it sounded like 2 or 3 people on the roof. My dad immediately grabbed his rifle. The 2 of them began to scan around the house, aiming upwards. That's when they saw them. 3 mirror images of the same girl, all walking in a circle with their heads down. They were like mindless zombies on top of the roof. When the Siguanabas saw that they were looking at them, they screamed and ran behind the house and disappeared. In the morning, my dad went to see the lady extremely early, and she performed a ritual on my dad to cleanse him. It took several hours that day, and he had to come back for several days, but he said it was worth it. He said he was finally fully cleansed, and he no longer saw the Siguanaba. I trust my dad more than anyone, and I know he wouldn't simply make this story up, especially from the look on his face when he told me. I can tell there's truth to it, maybe a bit too much truth. Number 6, Scary Mexico Story by Susan R. I was told this story by my aunt. In 2009, in Chihuahua, Mexico, there was this old abandoned slaughterhouse on the hillside, surrounded by a small neighborhood. A lot of the residents there would climb the hillside, where they had visibility to the roof of this old slaughterhouse. There they claimed to see rows upon rows of what appeared to be clothes. One neighbor even claimed to see a car drive up weekly to the entrance of the slaughterhouse, only to drop off a large black plastic bag, and by the following day, it would be gone. With this curious individual, and wondering why the black bags would mysteriously disappear overnight, my aunt decided that the next time the car came and left the bag, she would quickly go and check it out. As the black car made its weekly drop-off, my aunt watched the people in the car unload the bag and drove off. She quickly made her way to the bag to see what contents were inside. Upon her opening the bag, she was horrified to see a tiny old man inside who seemed to have been malnourished, on the brink of passing away. Her heart pounded so hard it felt like it was going to pound right out of her chest. She immediately called for help, got the attention of the neighbors nearby. They were all in fear of what might be going on and called the cops. As soon as the cops arrived, neighbors began reporting other strange occurrences that they suddenly started witnessing. The cops also investigated the claims of the clothes on the roof and found that they were the remnants of bodies of men and women and children that were later found. Just the bodies, anyway. The entire situation had sent horror throughout the city of Chihuahua, and people speculated who was behind the mass taking of these people. The hillside folk lived in fear for a while. The government then felt it was necessary to tear down the old slaughterhouse to put an end to the crazy psycho. Little did they know what would happen next. Over the course of the following weeks, on any given night, you could hear the residents of the hillside screaming in fear. Neighbors would share their eyewitness accounts of monsters. They roamed the streets, seeking shelter that they claimed they once had. Obviously skeptical, my aunt blew off the claims of these creatures roaming the streets, even after hearing the terrified screams of her neighbors night after night. The neighborhood was plagued by these things. Over the next few weeks, my aunt grew more and more skeptical, until one night as she was walking home from church, alone for that matter, she noticed for the first time in weeks the neighborhood was quiet. The night sky was dark, and she had only enough light to make her way home. As she turned a corner on the dirt road, she was startled at what she saw. In front of her walked a creature about the size of a medium-sized dog. The best she could describe it was it looked like a gargoyle. It was walking down the street when it suddenly stopped and glared at her. She stood frozen in fear, wanting to scream, but the sound just wouldn't escape her throat. The creature snarled and growled at her. She was paralyzed in fear, thinking that night would be her last. Just as the thing appeared to be getting ready to leap, a car came zooming by, startling it, and it immediately took off running into the dark shadows of the night. My aunt never prayed so hard in her life. She made it home safely and closed the door, fearing that the creature would return. Luckily, it never did. As the weeks went by, the sightings decreased. It seems as though the creature or creatures found a new place to call home, perhaps another abandoned building, or the many abandoned cave mines that fill the outskirts of the city. I don't know if I believe they are gargoyles or angry wandering spirits, but I definitely believe that she saw something. Number 7. The Slender Men by Smash Yoshi Films. I used to not believe in ghosts or paranormal activity, but this particular incident made me change my mind. It was 3 years ago, and I was 13. I was sleeping over at my friend's house. I had just gotten back from a basketball game and was heading over to my friend Jake's house for that aforementioned sleepover. I was just on his block when I suddenly saw a very tall man staring at me. I didn't tell my mom because I thought I was old enough to handle it myself. When I got to Jake's house, I told him about it because it kept bothering me, the thought of that oddly tall man. Once I was done telling him, he said on the news a few days ago, 3 boys had gone missing, and the mother said she saw a tall, dark man staring at her on her property only a few hours before the boys were gone. I didn't believe him. Sounded like some scary story nonsense, so I soon shrugged it off. Later, as we started playing video games down in the basement after watching some videos, Jake's mom wasn't home at the time, when we suddenly heard the back door shaking. Jake and I, surprised, ran up and checked. We even grabbed a couple of knives from the kitchen in the front of the house and quietly looked at the back door. Sure enough, there was an eerily tall man outside. I'm talking 8 feet tall, and his knees were still bent. He was staring at Jake and I. We took off as fast as possible, storming back down into the basement. We locked the door and called the police. 5 minutes later, they arrived, but didn't see anything, nor any trace of the man. Luckily, probably due to the missing children cases, they didn't get mad and said if we saw anything else, don't hesitate to call. A few hours later, after they were gone, we heard glass breaking. We stayed locked in the basement, and we even hid ourselves under a blanket in the corner. But the rest of the night afterwards was quiet, and we haven't seen the tall figure since. This took place in Mexico, just for your information, and it happened during an August day. No one knows what it was, and I'm still struggling to believe whether it was real or something exaggerated because I was afraid. Still, the image is quite clear in my mind. Number 8. My Grandpa and His Ghost by Alyssa B. When I was 15, I lived with my grandpa. I had lived in that house with my mom before when I was really young, and I always hated the upstairs floor because I had a strange encounter there when I was around 5 or 6. What had happened was I had been looking for my mom all over the house, and I was calling out for her. I had already looked upstairs, but since I had just looked in the basement, I figured she had time to go back up to her room, so I needed to check again. When I got back up to her bedroom and opened the door, I again called out to her, only to find a shadowy figure of a man sitting on her bed across from me. He was watching me, tilting his head in a curious way. I heard him imitate my call for Mom. With exactly my voice, with the way he looked, it was as if he was mimicking me because he didn't understand what it meant. But I screamed my head off and bolted downstairs, almost wanting to run backwards because I felt a presence behind me. I kept going until I finally did find my mom, who was then at the bottom of the stairs. That experience always haunted me. Now, my grandpa talked to his neighbors who had lived there longer than him, and they told him that there was an older man with a beard named Frank, who used to occupy the house. They said that he had passed away in the backyard while shoveling or raking. So, every time something unexplained happened to my grandpa, he had an ongoing joke about blaming Frank for it. For example, my grandpa had gotten a new camera to snap photos for his vacation. He had set it down on his desk before going to the bathroom for a few minutes. When he came back, it was gone. He searched all over the house and eventually gave up and bought a new one. But only a few days later, lo and behold, the old camera was sitting on the desk exactly where he'd left it. He laughed it off, saying things like, "Curse you, Frank. You just outed me $50. It was almost like they were buddies in their own weird way. Fast forward back to moving in as a teenager, I was still wary of that second floor. Throughout living there until I was 20, my room had to, of course, be upstairs. I experienced footsteps stomping down the stairs, which were just about 3 feet away from my own door. My door would often close by itself, even though if you opened it and left it open, it would stay where it was. My cat would often growl and glare into an empty corner. When I was about 18 and out to a movie with friends, my grandpa called me asking if I was home. I said no, that I was actually on my way back. He said that was odd, because he swore he heard me crying right outside his window, and when he went out to look, no one was there. A few days later, I was on the phone in bed and my cat kept jumping up and bugging me, so I locked her out for a while by shutting the door, at least until I was done with my conversation. After about a minute, she jumped back on the bed, which made me immediately look up at my door. Someone had opened it. Seconds later, I could hear a woman faintly crying from just outside my window. It lasted for what seemed like forever. It only stopped when I gathered the courage to get up and investigate. A few years later, when I was 21, I moved out as my grandpa's health began to deteriorate due to his alcoholism, and despite my help, he just wouldn't help himself. I was getting sick of it, plus it seemed like the activity wasn't going to cease. 6 months after, my grandpa passed away. Honestly, it came as a huge shock, and for a while I blamed myself, felt like I had abandoned him. But I had to remind myself that it was his choice to keep drinking, and that if I stayed, he still wouldn't have lived any longer. The house was sold to the bank because he just honestly didn't take very good care of it, and luckily the locks hadn't been changed right away. So I was able to grab a few personal items for my apartment that I had left there. When my husband and I walked through the house, it was eerily dark and cold, like a ghost of the house I knew growing up. I soaked it all in, all the memories I would never be able to visit again, because Grandpa was gone. I still struggle coping with it. Anyway, I felt like I was being watched the entire time, which I didn't mention to my husband, because it was just the vibe that you felt at the house and it was nothing new really. The weirdest part about all of this, though, was months later, my mom and aunt spoke to an alleged psychic who said my grandpa hadn't moved away yet. She said he's staying with the boy, who we assumed is my little brother who had Down syndrome. Plus, during his life, my grandpa had watched my brother at least every other weekend for his entire life. Before he was cremated, my mom tried to gently tug my brother into looking at Grandpa, but he shook his head and refused to do it. I like to believe that Grandpa stays with David to keep him at peace. But the psychic said that Grandpa also hangs out with someone else in the afterlife, an older man with a beard. They spent weeks trying to decipher who they were talking about, but I knew all along. She was talking about Frank. So if you find an old yet pretty house in a small town in Mexico, you might just get to see Frank and even my grandpa. Number 9. Why I Ain't Ever Visiting Mexico by Kate. I used to work as a housekeeper in a nursing home. One day at lunch, our department got into a conversation about the paranormal. Surprisingly, many of them had quite a few stories. One story was told to me by my friend from Mexico. This one easily stood out above the rest. I was on edge the entire night after being told this. Anyway, my work friend was in her 50s, but back when she was in her 20s, she was visiting her mom in Mexico. She was at her mom's house. She and her siblings had always had odd experiences there. They would hear the sound of a woman sobbing in the backyard at night, but there would be no one there when they checked, along with other little creepy things. On this specific occasion, my friend was at her mother's home. She was staying in one of the spare rooms. During the night, my friend woke up to the feeling of something like a person crawling on top of her blankets. She said she held super still, and whatever it was crawled all the way up her body until she could feel something sniffing her face. There wasn't anything there, at least nothing that was visible to the human eye. The next morning, she told her family what happened, but no one believed her. A few weeks later, her brother stayed in the same room, and something similar happened to him. She told me this almost 3 years ago, but I still get freaked out just thinking about it. She said she won't stay the night at her mom's house anymore, and I can't really blame her. And number 10, Inhuman Spirits by AJS. This story takes place in a small farmer's town called Rancho Grande, located in the center of Zacatecas, Mexico. I was 13 years old at the time, and life where I lived was real hard to get around. You had to work every day until it was dark out, and hopefully make enough to come back home with food. Before I begin, I want to say that the event really changed me, in the way that I have no fear of anything else if it's not up to par compared to this. I woke up in a panic, thinking that I was going to be late for work. I got up, put on my work clothes, got on my horse to go catch up with my father and my brother, thinking that they were already in the cornfield. In the distance, I saw something that I can't seem to believe even to this day. Little by little, I got closer to that strange thing, and my body began to tremble and feel cold as I did. My horse began to neigh and refused to go forward. Suddenly, the strange thing was closer to me now. I couldn't believe what my eyes were seeing. What I had in front of me was a white donkey mounted by a black specter that appeared to be a person trying to be a scarecrow. He, or whatever this was, wanted to reach out and touch me, and my horse recoiled, preventing me from colliding with it. Adrenaline pumping through my veins and a cold sweat running over my body. I shouted, "Who are you? What are you doing?" Without an answer, the thing insisted on trying to touch me, but my horse always protected me. Suddenly, the donkey and the specter shifted to be behind my horse and we struggled to stay away from them. As strangely and as quickly as I had seen it, the two of them suddenly burst into a strange mist and faded away in the wind. I was speechless at that point, and the last thing I remember is that my horse began to run back to our house. When we stopped, I collapsed in front of my mother, and upon regaining composure and consciousness, I was lying in my bed with my father scolding me for never coming to work that day. But my mother told him that the horse had practically brought me back unconscious, and she started telling my father what had happened to me. But I don't think any of us really knew what happened. Mexico has a vast culture, oftentimes rich and beautiful, and other times terrifying and all too real. Whether you encounter the fairies of Mesoamerica, or you inhabit a home in Mexico with something invisible to your own eyes that doesn't want you there, there are all sorts of horrors that await you. No matter where you go in the world, there will always be real ghost stories. Good night. Be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe if you enjoyed the video. Don't forget, you can send me your stories at darknessprevails.org. If you want to support my channel further, donate $1 or more at patreon.com/darknessprevails. You'll get your name at the end of the videos in the credits. Or if you got a little bit more cash, you can get Darkness Prevails merchandise at morbidmonsters.com, or just click the shop button below. Now, here are my 5 favorite early comments from the previous video about the 10 most horrifying true stories from California. Zena Wolf asks, do you have a Discord server? Also, great work, my dude. I did have a Discord server that I used for live interviews for a podcast that I tried to make, but my time just gets away from me. Making nearly an hour's worth of content every other day, and working on some games on the side, I don't have time for what I want to do anymore. But I think it'll be worth it. Stay tuned, Zena. Thorn says, first my home state, now Cali. Where will you go next? Well, Mexico today, then maybe back up north to America, and maybe we'll head east. Let's see how it goes. Jose Dominguez says, left the rub hub with the quickness. Okay, Jose, let's not lie or exaggerate about how fast you finished. You only clicked over because you were already done. Cooper Clark says, apparently straws are bad. Yeah, Cooper. Like, straws aren't bad, and plastic straws are not going to single-handedly destroy the entire environment. But you can go ahead and exchange your freedom for security. We'll just all lay down face down in the grass, just to be sure we don't hurt planet Earth. I'm all for environmental protection, but banning straws isn't going to fix as much as you think it will. Hence why that became such a meme. Crazy Genius 101 says, yeah, a new video, and oh crap, I want to go there for college. I better watch out. A California college, huh? Good luck with that. Let's hope California doesn't break off and become its own island before you graduate. Anyways, guys, thanks so much for tuning in to another Darkness Prevails episode. Stay tuned for more upcoming scary stories. Until then, here are the credits to my awesome patrons. Until next time, remember, stay safe out there and stay creepy, because this world is a strange one.